We are a species that, splits atoms and beams 4K video from space, yet 90% of everything you own still moves across the globe on giant, slow-moving metal boats.
It is pretty wild to think about.
It really is. So welcome to our deep dive. Today we are unpacking the core concepts behind the geopolitical analysis called Prisoners of the Map, why geography still matters.
Which is such a fascinating source to dig into.
Absolutely. And we have one massive kind of overarching mission for this conversation. In our modern era of artificial intelligence, instant global connectivity, and, hypersonic missiles, does geography still actually dictate who holds the power?
Right, because we sort of assume it doesn't anymore.
Exactly. And whether you are, say, prepping for a global business meeting today, or you simply want to know the hidden mechanics of how the world actually works, by the time we wrap up this deep dive, you will look at a world map, not just as some dusty relic from middle school, but really as the ultimate cheat sheet for understanding tomorrow's headlines.
I love that framing, a cheat sheet, because it really is.
Yeah. So let's start with what the source material calls the grand illusion of the modern age, this whole idea of the borderless world. We toss around words like cyberspace and the cloud, and it creates this subconscious feeling that we have finally built a society that just, floats weightlessly above the dirt.
Yeah, it's honestly a brilliant piece of modern marketing. We just assume that because globalization made supply chains so highly efficient,
right,
and because the internet gave us instant communication, the physical map has just been rendered obsolete. Distance is supposed to be dead.
Right, distance is dead.
Yeah.
That's the mantra.
But that ethereal cloud that everyone relies on, it is entirely tethered to the ocean floor. If you want to send, say, a terabyte of data from New York to London, it is not bouncing through the atmosphere as some kind of magic Wi-Fi.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. We treat the internet like this invisible, omnipresent force, but really it's just a giant, deeply vulnerable plumbing system, isn't it?
Exactly. It's plumbing. That data is traveling as light through a physical glass tube, and this tube is roughly the thickness of a garden hose, just resting in the freezing mud of the Atlantic Ocean.
Wow. A garden hose.
Yeah, and those submarine cables, they have to be laid by physical ships. They follow very specific underwater trenches and ridges to avoid, seismic fault lines, and they have to emerge at highly secure physical landing stations on the coast.
So the geography of the ocean floor actually dictates where the internet goes.
Completely. And vulnerable is the key word here. If an anchor drags in the wrong spot or a deliberate actor cuts a physical cable at a shallow choke point, the cloud effectively just vanishes for millions of people.
That is, it's terrifying.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's not just data either. The energy required to power those massive server farms flows through physical pipelines laid across very specific geographic terrain.
Right. The power has to come from somewhere.
Exactly. Even our satellite networks, which seem, entirely detached from the Earth, they must be launched from physical geography near the equator for maximum rotational velocity.
Wait, really? They have to be near the equator?
Yeah, for the physics to work best. And then they orbit specific physical coordinates to provide useful surveillance or GPS data. They're still tied to the map.
I hear that, but I have to push back a little here based on, modern military tech. What about the tools of modern warfare or high-speed travel? Don't hypersonic missiles and long-range aircraft just bypass borders entirely?
It's a fair question.
They don't have to stop at a customs checkpoint. They fly right over the mountains and the oceans, rendering all those physical barriers kind of meaningless, right?
So this is where the source makes a really critical distinction between the tools of power and the arena of power.
Okay. Tools versus arena.
Right. Technology dramatically changes the tools. It changes how power is projected, the speed at which it moves, and the tactical surprise it offers. But geography permanently shapes the arena in which that power is exercised.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, so think about a hypersonic missile traveling at Mach 5. It still relies on targeting data generated by physical radar arrays. It still targets a physical asset like a port, a runway, a command center, and that asset derives its strategic value from its location.
Right, you're not just bombing a random patch of ocean. You're hitting a specific geographic asset.
Precisely. And more importantly, geography dictates the sustainability of those tools. An aircraft requires a physical runway to land, refuel, and rearm.
Fuel doesn't come out of thin air.
Exactly. Distance dictates fuel consumption, payload limits, and logistical supply chains. If a military operates 1,000 miles from its physical borders, the laws of physics and geography dictate how long they can actually sustain that operation.
So we basically just got distracted by the shiny new tools we built on top of the map.
Exactly. We got distracted by the tools, but the underlying arena hasn't changed at all.
Because the underlying arena is still the physical Earth. And if we strip away the data cables and the missile silos, that arena has always been built around one defining physical element, which is water.
Water. It is the absolute foundation of human power. If you want to understand modern geopolitics, you really have to look at the origins of human civilization.
Right, because geography basically determined where human beings could survive and scale up.
Exactly. Egypt emerged specifically along the Nile. Mesopotamia flourished because it was nestled right between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Ancient China developing along the Yellow River, the Indus Valley civilization around its respective river systems. I mean, water was essentially the first frictionless highway.
It really was. It was survival, agriculture, and transportation just rolled into one. Moving a ton of grain over land in the ancient world required, animals, massive amounts of feed, and navigating really treacherous terrain.
Which is incredibly expensive and slow.
Right. But moving that same ton of grain on a river just required a barge and a current. It was exponentially cheaper and faster.
Which creates a massive economic advantage.
And those geographic realities created the first great centers of power. And the thing is, modern trade networks and massive industrial centers today still heavily reflect those geographical advantages that were laid down millennia ago.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because that brings us back to that jarring contradiction I mentioned at the very start of the show. We have the technology to literally go to Mars, yet 90% of world trade by volume is currently sitting on the water.
90%. It's staggering. Energy supplies, raw materials, the rare earth metals inside your smartphone, the food in your grocery store, they are almost entirely traveling across the global oceans.
But we just built better boats.
Yeah, technology completely transformed the ships. They are massive, automated, and hyper-efficient now, but it did not replace the water itself.
Because the oceans are basically the ultimate global highways.
Yeah.
And history shows this really clear sequence of global power simply based on who figured out how to secure those sea lanes.
Oh, the maritime succession is undeniable in the history books. Think about Portugal. It was a small nation, but its geographic position right on the edge of the Atlantic allowed it to escape the endless land wars of Europe.
Right, they could just look outward.
Exactly. They built a massive maritime empire. Spain expanded on that model. Then Britain leveraged its status as an island, which is a concept we'll get to shortly,
right,
to focus entirely on naval supremacy.
And that made them the world's dominant power for centuries.
Right. And then following the Second World War, the United States basically inherited and secured that global maritime system.
So the rule is you can't be a global superpower without a navy.
Pretty much. A nation cannot be a true global superpower without the ability to project maritime power, because without maritime trade, the modern global economy instantly collapses.
Well, and since the oceans operate as this massive interconnected superhighway, logic kind of dictates that the real leverage doesn't lie in controlling the open water. It lies in controlling the off-ramps and the bottlenecks.
Right. In geopolitics, those bottlenecks are called chokepoints.
Chokepoints.
Yeah. A choke point is a narrow geographic passage through which an outsized, critical amount of the world's trade or energy is physically forced to pass. The global economy essentially hinges on three prime examples mentioned in the source.
Okay, let's go through them. The first is the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East, right?
Yes. It's this incredibly narrow corridor between the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. It handles a massive percentage of the world's daily oil consumption.
And it is narrow. I mean, looking at a map, it's a tiny little gap.
It is so narrow that any instability or even just the threat of someone mining that water sends global energy prices spiking within minutes.
Wow. Okay, what's the second one?
Then you have the Suez Canal in Egypt. We have seen firsthand how a single block container ship there doesn't just delay local traffic, it cascades through the entire global supply chain.
Oh, yeah. Like a factory in Ohio shuts down because it relies on just-in-time manufacturing, and the specific microchip it needs is suddenly stuck behind a traffic jam in the Red Sea. Exactly, it's all connected. And finally, you have the Strait of Malacca, which links the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. It is basically the jugular vein for the economies of East Asia.
It's essentially taking a global, free-flowing 10-lane superhighway and just forcing it to merge into a single dirt road.
That's a perfect analogy.
I mean, imagine being a world leader, knowing your entire domestic economy, the jobs, the energy grids, the manufacturing, depends on a tiny waterway halfway across the world that you have absolutely zero control over.
Right. What's fascinating here is how geography completely inverts our standard assumptions about size. These choke points are physically microscopic on a globe,
Tiny specks.
yet their position provides immense leverage. Location creates leverage, leverage creates influence, and influence creates power.
Which makes sense. Because these waterways are so vital and so vulnerable, global powers desperately need forward operating bases to guard the approaches to them.
Yes.
Which brings us to a geographic feature that used to be about hiding from the world, but is now entirely about controlling it. Islands.
Islands are crucial. Historically, island geography provided insulation. Like, the English Channel acted as a giant moat for Britain.
Right, they couldn't just be marched on by a neighboring army.
Exactly, because they didn't have to constantly fear massive land armies marching across their borders. They didn't have to pour all their wealth into a standing defensive army. They could pour it outward into a navy.
And Japan benefited from a very similar geographic insulation for much of its history, right?
Yes, exactly. But the dynamic has completely flipped today. We aren't fighting medieval land wars anymore. When you look at modern strategic competition, especially in the Indo-Pacific, islands aren't about insulation at all.
They're about projection.
Yes. Today, islands act as stationary aircraft carriers. The Indo-Pacific is the most vital maritime region on Earth because it links the Indian and Pacific Oceans, which is the heart of global economic growth right now.
Right.
If you control a tiny speck of rock in that region, you can build a runway. You can install advanced radar, surface-to-air missiles, and anti-ship batteries.
So you essentially create this invisible bubble of control over hundreds of miles of open ocean.
Precisely. In military terms, it is called anti-access area denial. You dictate who can and cannot operate in those surrounding waters.
Because you have missiles parked on a reef, basically.
Yeah. Islands extend a nation's military reach far beyond its mainland coast. In the modern geopolitical chessboard, islands are the ultimate prize because their location offers power projection that even massive, resource-rich continental territories simply cannot replicate.
Okay, so we've explored the abstract rules of the map. We've talked about the physical infrastructure of the internet, the oceans, the choke points, the islands. Let's look at how these rules dictate the hand a specific nation is dealt today.
That's a great transition, yeah.
Because the source uses India as perhaps the ultimate real-world case study for this, right?
It does, and India's geography is utterly unique. Just kind of paint the map in your mind. The Indian Peninsula doesn't just sit on the edge of the water. Its entire southern half thrusts deeply into the center of the Indian Ocean.
Like it's pointing right into the middle of everything.
Exactly. It hovers directly over those major maritime trade routes connecting East Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe.
They're geographically positioned right in the center of the action.
They really are. As economic gravity continues to shift toward Asia, the Indian Ocean is the central arena of 21st century geopolitics. India is physically placed at the undisputed center of it, offering incredible maritime advantages.
But they also have a massive land border problem.
Right. India is forced to balance that maritime opportunity with an incredibly demanding continental reality to its north.
Right, because you look north, and they're basically boxed in by the Himalayas. It's a literal physical wall isolating them from China.
It's a massive wall. The Himalayas act as an impenetrable barrier to traditional mass land trade or, deep continental integration with their biggest neighbor. It essentially forces India's economic focus southward toward the water.
But they can't just ignore the north.
No, they can't. They still have to manage highly complex, historically tense land borders with nuclear-armed neighbors in incredibly rugged terrain.
That is a tough spot to be in.
Very few nations have to balance such a demanding dual reality. I mean, investing heavily in a deep-water navy to secure the ocean while simultaneously maintaining massive mountain infantry units to secure the high-altitude borders. Geography places them on the board with immense opportunity, but it also imposes severe constraints.
So what does this all mean? How does a country actually process that kind of geographic tension over decades and centuries?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because this leads to the concept of the psychology of maps. It is the idea that these geographic realities actually seep into the very mindset of a nation. It's essentially geographic PTSD.
Geographic PTSD is an incredibly accurate way to frame it. Geography doesn't just shape military procurement, like buying ships or tanks.
Yeah.
It fundamentally shapes national psychology and strategic culture.
Right.
A nation's historical experience with its physical borders dictates its modern instincts.
Think about a nation that sits on massive, flat plains with no natural mountain ranges or oceans to protect it. Over centuries, they are repeatedly invaded. Their modern foreign policy isn't just a political choice, it's an inherited survival mechanism.
Yes. Consider the vast, flat expanse of the European plain leading into Russia. Historically, that flat geography facilitated invasions by Napoleon, by Hitler, and others.
There are no speed bumps.
Exactly, no geographic speed bumps. When a nation is repeatedly attacked across an undefended plain, its strategic culture develops a deep, enduring paranoia.
Which makes total sense.
The instinct is to constantly push outward, to create physical buffer states, to keep potential threats as far away from the core as possible. It's a defensive expansion.
And then contrast that with the U.S.
Right. Conversely, a nation like the United States, surrounded by weak neighbors and two massive oceans, develops a completely different strategic culture, one of intrinsic security and outward economic projection.
So when a world leader acts defensively, or seemingly aggressively, it might not just be their personal political ideology at play. It's literally the ghost of their geography talking.
Yeah. If we connect this to the bigger picture, strategic anxiety rarely materializes out of thin air. It is born from enduring physical realities.
It's built into the ground they walk on.
Exactly. A nation surrounded by close competitors calculates risk fundamentally differently than one isolated by mountains or water. These anxieties, these fears and ambitions, they persist for centuries.
Long after the leaders are gone.
They outlast any single government, any dictator, or democratic administration. That is why maps are so deeply revealing. A map isn't just lines on paper showing territory. A map is a visual representation of a nation's inherited fears, its permanent ambitions, and its cold, calculated strategic realities.
The physical realities outlast the political ones. Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of our deep dive today. The big takeaway from the source material isn't that geography guarantees your success or strictly dictates your failure.
Right, geography is not destiny.
Geography is not destiny, but it definitively sets the playing field.
Technology evolves at a blistering pace. It changes the tactical approaches, the speed of conflict, and the reach of communication.
Right.
But geography remains the immovable force that influences where power can actually go, how sustainable it is once it gets there, and what a nation's grand strategy must ultimately be. The tools evolve, but the arena endures.
And this is exactly why this matters for you. Because when you turn on the news tomorrow and you hear about a tense diplomatic standoff over some tiny speck of coral in the Pacific.
Or a sudden spike in shipping insurance rates through a narrow strait.
Right. Or a dispute over where a submarine data cable makes landfall, you will know exactly the mechanics behind the conflict. Understanding that oceans, mountains, and choke points still secretly govern our digital world makes you infinitely better equipped to see the why behind the headlines.
You aren't just passively reacting to the news anymore.
Exactly. You are reading the underlying code.
The nations and the individuals who prosper in the future will not be the ones who ignore geography in favor of a purely digital illusion. They will be the ones who deeply understand how to marry the two realities.
Which leaves us with one final kind of lingering thought to explore on your own. We talked about how maps reveal a nation's deep-seated psychology and its strategic anxieties, that geographic PTSD.
Yeah.
So if geography truly dictates the permanent fears and survival instincts of a society, how much of a country's future political behavior can you predict right now just by staring at a blank, silent map of its borders? Keep questioning, keep exploring the physical world around you, and as always, keep looking beyond the surface. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you for joining us on this Strategic Vanguard podcast. If you found value in this analysis, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you fresh podcasts every Monday here on YouTube and Rumble, and you can also catch the audio versions on Spotify and Amazon Music. Just search for Strategic Vanguard Podcast. For more insights, articles, and discussions, subscribe to our blog at strategicvanguard.com. Your support helps us grow and bring you more in-depth analysis on defense, geopolitics, and strategy. Until next time, stay informed, stay strategic.